Yeah.
Yep, that's all good.
Thank you. Okay, dokes. So we have two brilliant speakers. We have John Parker, who is the CEO of the Arboricultural Association, who's going to talk about young tree establishment. He's literally just got off his second webinar of the day. This is going to be his third, so I hope he still has a voice. And then we have Richard Arnold, who is the director of Treecraft, and he will talk about the remit of a tree surgeon versus an arboricultural consultant, which I find really hard to say, tree preservation orders, and British standard reports for trees. Just a tiny bit of sort of housekeeping stuff. There is a chat function, which is more for sort of social stuff. If you have a proper question, can you put it in the Q&A, which you'll see on the screen down the bottom? Just click on that and put your question in there. And then at the end of each speaker's section, we will have time for questions. If you do want to, I'm basically going to read your question out. If you want to be on camera and say your question out loud, then just click the raise your hand button, which also you should see on the doc. And yeah, this is being recorded and we will share it afterwards. I will now hand over to John, who will take it from here and stop sharing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julia. I've just put in the chat, by the way, a link to the Arb Association's Arboricultural Resources page, because I'm going to be talking quite a lot about this document, an introductory guide to young tree establishment, which is freely available online, so you can access that now or later, whenever you want, but it just might help as I'm going along. And I will now attempt to share my screen. For someone who does a lot of webinars, this is obviously going to go wrong in some way or another, but we will do what we can. I believe you should be able to see my screen. Can I get a thumbs up from either Richard or Julia? Marvelous. Okay. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us, and thank you, Julia, for inviting me to speak. It's a great honour. It's fantastic to speak to garden designers. Normally I speak to arboriculturalists, and I'm very much of the opinion that we need to get outside of that bubble and speak to people across different disciplines and professions. So this is a wonderful opportunity. Thank you. As Julia said, I'm the Chief Executive Officer at the Arboricultural Association, and I've got about 30 minutes to talk to you about young tree establishment. And the way it's going to work is I'll do a little bit of an introduction just to explain who the Arboricultural Association is really. Then I wanted to run you through a couple of things that I think are common problems when it comes to tree planting and tree establishment. Then I'll look at this document that I just mentioned, an introductory guide to young tree establishment, and then we'll wrap it up with some conclusions. Bang on 30 minutes. Absolutely no way that can go wrong at all. So we'll definitely do that. Okay, so introductions. Arboriculture, what is it? Julia said it's always difficult to say the word. It's one of the biggest problems we face in our profession, is that people don't know what the word means, they don't know how to say it, they don't really understand it, and that's a huge barrier for us. This morning I was giving a talk in person, actually, at Preston at Arbor Day at Myerscough College up in Lancashire, about just this subject, how nobody knows about arboriculture and how difficult that is for us. So what is arboriculture? Well, here at the Arboricultural Association, we have come up with a definition that it's the science and practice of the cultivation, establishment and management of amenity trees for the benefit of society. So we're managing the trees, and we like trees, otherwise we wouldn't be doing this, but it's about people, it's about society. That's really what we're doing it for. But in even more simple terms, arboriculture means tree care. That's the words that we've started using to try and make it really clear about what we do. 2 one-syllable words, tree care. That's what we're all about in arboriculture. The Arboricultural Association, we're the main professional body for arboriculture in the UK, and probably the second biggest internationally as well. And we've got a vision. We've got a vision. We've got to have a vision. Inspiring, supporting and promoting the tree care community for a society that better appreciates and cares for trees. And you can find out lots more about the Arboricultural Association on our various websites, but trees.org.uk is the one to go for. And I just wanted to give you a bit of context. This isn't a sales pitch. I just want to give you a bit of context as to why I'm here really, and what it is that we're doing. The Arboricultural Association is a charity. We're a membership organisation. We've got about 3,000 members, mainly in the UK, but some internationally as well. And I put down including associate members, because obviously the vast majority of people who sign up to the association are professional arboriculturalists, but we also have an associate membership category, which we want to encourage horticulturalists, landscapers, garden designers, ecologists, foresters, anyone else who's got an interest in the work we're doing is more than welcome to join us. And we do a lot of training. We do an awful lot of events. We hold webinars. The one we've just finished was our 68th webinar since COVID struck. So we've done quite a few of them. We run the accreditation schemes for arboriculture in the UK. That's the approved contractor scheme and the registered consultant scheme, where members of the public can search for a sort of legitimate, good, high quality contractor or arboriculturalist near where they live. And they can do that through our website. And we provide technical advice and guidance, and we also do a lot of publications, one of which is the one that I'm going to be talking about as we go along today. And we also do a bit of political, public and cross-sector engagement. And like I say, it's really exciting to be here talking to you, because we need to break out of those silos. We spend far too much time talking to ourselves, saying how great trees are, when we already know how great trees are. We need to go and talk to other people. So I've identified a few problems. This is all my opinion, but it is sort of backed up with the opinions of people that I speak to. I talk to a lot of people working in arboriculture. And when it comes to tree planting, these are some of the big things that I wanted to address this evening. The first one is the obsession with planting numbers. We all hear about planting our way out of the climate emergency. Spoiler alert, we're not going to do that. So the obsession with planting numbers is not very helpful. There's a failure to consider specifications when it comes to planting, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. There's a massive failure to consider aftercare. There's this idea that we can go out and chuck millions of trees in the ground, and as if by magic, they're all just going to turn into wonderful mature specimens, and we don't really pay adequate attention to how we're going to go from seedling to sapling through to veteran or ancient tree. And there's a lack of professional engagement. And this is where I try and tell you that there's arboriculturalists out there who you can work with on your projects. The obsession with planting numbers, we've all heard it. I think 2019 was peak tree. That's when just before the election, all the different political parties in the UK were outbidding each other with how many trees they were going to plant. And we got up to sort of, 200 million trees. It just escalated and escalated and escalated. And there's a real problem with that, because when you're just focusing on planting numbers, you're not necessarily thinking about where you're planting, how you're planting them, what you're planting, where you're getting them from. You're just trying to chuck trees into the ground. And that really isn't the best way to go about it. There's a real lack of thought for the size of tree that's going in, for the species of tree that's going in. When you just chase tree planting numbers, when you're just committing to plant millions and millions of trees, something kind of inevitable happens. The size of tree you're planting gets smaller and smaller and smaller. It's just whips, because that's all that's available in the kind of numbers we're talking about. And it's almost always native trees. Now, there's a wonderful place in the world for native trees. They're very, very important. But if we are going to address the twin crises of biodiversity and of climate, we need to diversify our tree species. We cannot just rely on the native tree species, the 30 or so native tree species. We've got to diversify. But when you just focus on the numbers, it's native trees that really get the most attention. We don't think about the provenance of the trees. We just say, I need some trees, please. And somebody sends out a bundle of trees and you stick them in the ground and everyone's happy and you've had a nice day out. You've done a lovely planting day. Where are those trees coming from? You've got to think about the biosecurity of it, but I'm thinking more here about the provenance. You may have a 500-year-old oak tree in your park, which has done fantastically well in this climate for 500 years. You collect the acorns of that tree, you grow it on. They may well do very well, but a tree that's been doing well for 500 years in one place may well not be doing that well for the next 500 years because the climate is completely changing. So you may need to look at different places for your provenance of your seeds. Don't just rely on local seed collection, because we've got to consider the future climate. And all of this can sometimes lead to inappropriate planting. This is a really depressing photograph I took not a million miles away from me, apart from the fact that this area It's sort of water meadows, really. It shouldn't be planted up. People used to go down there and have picnics and nice things, but it was seen as a place you could dump loads of trees in. So they've done that. We've got the classic forests of plastic has appeared. But even in order to make a bit more space to plant new trees, they've also hacked down some of these alders that were holding up the riverbank as well. So this is the removal of existing trees, the removal of established trees to plant new trees. Because when you're chasing planting targets, there's no points for keeping trees. There's not even any points for keeping trees alive. There's only points for chucking them in the ground. So that's something we really need to try and move away from. There's a failure to consider specifications. Where are you planting the tree? Are you planting the correct tree for the location you're looking at? What are you planting? Have you actually thought about what you're planting? What reason are you planting for? Are you planting for shade, for biodiversity, for water interception, for aesthetics, for berries, whatever it is? Think carefully about what you're planting. The size of the tree, I'm going to go into a bit more of this in more detail later, but there's lots of different sizes available. You can plant huge trees, you can plant tiny trees. They all have a place, but it depends on what you're actually trying to achieve. And root type is the same thing. Bare root, containerized, root board. What kind of tree do you need and why do you need to get it? And you've got to think of the current and the future conditions. In arboriculture, we think in tree time. We don't think about what something looks like at the end of a project or when that new park or new garden is opened. We're trying to look down the line, decades, centuries down the line. So we have to think on a sort of unusual time scale. And that brings all this together, whether it's the species and the climatic conditions, we've got to look long term. And the staking method is one of my real bugbears. Please don't plant trees with a crossbar across like this. This isn't good for trees. Trees like to be able to move. It's through moving in the wind that they put on the growth they need to be able to be stable and to grow up. If you attach them to cross beams like this, not only are they inevitably going to grow on to rub against the timber that you've put against them and will cause damage further down the line, but also there's going to be a weakness in there too, because only the part of the tree above that connection is going to be able to move around. So don't do that. There's a lot of research out there suggests this is not the way you should be planting trees. Although in fairness, the staking method isn't the main problem with these trees. Vandalism has what got these trees, but the staking method wasn't great. There's a failure to consider aftercare, watering. Watering. It's one of the most important things. There's two very important things, but watering is hugely important. Make sure you're putting them on a proper watering program. Think about young tree maintenance. A lot of the work that we have to do with chainsaws, causing a lot of disruption and a lot of damage to the tree, could have been dealt with a pair of secateurs 20 or 30 years ago, if only someone had looked at the future, if they understand the branching structure and how that tree is going to grow. Think about your tree pit materials. Mulch is magical. We love mulch. Put mulch down. But if you're in an urban area, if you're in a pavement, for example, mulch might not be suitable. Think about what you're going to lay around that tree. Think about how much room that tree is going to have to grow. Again, there's some great documentation out there which talks about tree pit materials. And your stake and ties, not just what you're putting on there, but also making sure they're not rubbing against them. So many times I've seen trees damaged by the stake that was installed to protect the tree. And it's only happened because over time, as the tree's grown, nobody's gone back to make sure it's okay. Nobody's gone back to remove that stake and tie or to adjust it or to loosen it. They've just left it there. And without proper aftercare, what you end up with is this. Somebody's done their development and they've done a lovely landscaping design with various things going on there. And every single one of the tree they planted is dead. You can see in the background there, there's some trees in leaf. This is during the summer. Those trees should all be green and lovely, but they're all dead. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money. It doesn't look good. And it just makes everyone feel a little bit disillusioned with trees and what they could achieve for us. And there's a lack of professional engagement a lot of the time. There's often no involvement from an arboriculturalist. So I'm thinking in not only in garden design or landscape design, but in developments, particularly when we see this, no involvement at all. They're either not involved or they're involved very, very late at the last minute. Everything else is considered, your roads, your utilities, your buildings, everything else. The trees are just the afterthought. They're the thing that get chucked in whenever there's space to do it. We need to design more holistically. We need to think about trees as critical infrastructure. They're not just something green and fluffy you chuck in afterwards because it looks nice and it ticks a box. They should be critical infrastructure that, if planted properly, will be an investment that increases in value for decades and centuries to come. There's certainly a lack of pre-planting involvement from arboriculturalists, which is why we don't always get the right species mix, we don't get the right specifications. And there's a lack of post-planting involvement as well. The arboriculturalist is normally just involved for the shorter time as possible, because you don't want to mess around paying arboriculturalists to tell you what you shouldn't be doing with trees. But they need to be in there all the way through. And what you end up with is this classic car parking here. That was a tree down there in the middle between the bins. Now it's just being used to prop up one of the bins. Why? Well, it was probably the wrong species in the wrong place with no maintenance, left to fester. It died, it got cut down, but it's not been replaced other than by that waste paper bin. All very depressing and so easily avoidable. Come on, we can do so much better. So partly in response to the national obsession with tree planting, relatively recently, last year, maybe the year before, the Arboricultural Association produced this little document, an introductory guide to young tree establishment. I'm not saying it's perfect. I was the main author on it, so I'm obviously biased. I think it's quite useful, but I'm sure it could always be improved. It's aimed at non-arboriculturalists. It's aimed at community groups, members of the public, or related professions as well, who might get involved in planting trees. Came out in May 2022, and it provides practical advice and some signposting to other documents. It's not a replacement for professional advice, but it hopefully can give a bit of inspiration to send people onto the right places. And again, to give a little plug to the Arb Association website, you can download it for free on the website, or if you'd like a beautiful glossy hard copy, then you can get hold of one of those as well. So this document really is made up of, I can't remember, I'm going to say 5 sections, but I might have to change that in a minute because I can't remember how many bullet points I put on there. We've got why plant a tree, where to plant a tree, what tree to plant, how to plant a tree, young tree establishment, and tree watering. So 6 sections, even better, even more value than the 5 sections I just mentioned. Trying to take you all the way through the stages of tree planting and tree establishment. And each one of those sections has got a load of information, but it's also got a nice poster. We produce posters, very easy, sort of little A4 posters as kind of graphic representations of the things you need to think about. And I'm just going to take a little bit of time now. Where are we? I'm about halfway through. Hasn't time flown? I'm about halfway through. I'll just run through some of the key things to consider that you will find inside this document. So why plant a tree? We all know that trees are good. We like trees. And the way we tend to divide this up in arboriculture now is to say that there are environmental benefits, social benefits, and economic benefits to planting trees and to looking after trees. These are the benefits that trees bring us. And collectively, they're sometimes known as ecosystem services. It might be a term that you've heard, not a particularly sexy term, but quite a useful term when you're talking to engineers. They like that sort of language. But when you're planting a tree, when you're selecting something, it's so important to think about what you want at the end of it. All trees are different. They all grow to different sizes. They do different things. Some have berries, some have nice bark, some get really big, some stay really narrow. What are you trying to achieve? Unless you know what you're trying to achieve through your tree planting, it's very, very unlikely you're going to have a successful experience of tree planting. All too often, we just have people saying, well, I need to plant a tree because it's specified that I've got to plant a tree. So I'm just going to put a tree in there. And they don't really think about whether it's an oak or a cherry or a lime or a tulip tree, all of which do vastly different things. So think about why you want to plant that tree. Maybe you just want it to look beautiful like this one. This is an Amelanchier that we planted in my hometown of Stonehouse quite recently, and has these beautiful flowers. So if you get bored of my talk, you can just look at beautiful pictures of flowers like that. What tree to plant? So again, intention. Why are you planting the tree? That's really going to inform what you're going to plant. Where are you getting it from? Biosecurity is so important. So many of the pests and diseases that our trees are struggling and suffering from in this country were brought here deliberately. They're brought here accidentally, but they were imported. They didn't need to get here. We've got a really good defense in the UK with the Channel. Most stuff shouldn't get here. Oak processionary moth was imported. Dutch elm disease was imported. Chalara dieback of ash could have blown across the channel, but we also know that it was imported. We're worried about emerald ash borer. We're worried about Ceratocystis platani. We're worried about Asian longhorn beetle. All of these pests and diseases are probably going to be brought in by people importing them. So think very carefully about where you're sourcing your trees from. Source trees from a UK grown nursery if you can, or if they are being imported, make sure they've gone through an appropriate period of quarantine. Probably the most important thing I'll say to you in this entire talk, if you're going out to buy trees for a garden, wherever you're getting them from, ask to see that nursery's biosecurity policy. If they don't have one, go to another nursery. Try and look for Plant Healthy. It's a very important recent scheme that's been introduced, Plant Healthy Accreditation Scheme. That's the big thing. You don't want to be the person who brings Xylella fastidiosa into this country. You need to think about the size of the tree you're planting. Do you want the instant impact of a big tree? Advantages, it's got that instant impact. It might be less open to vandalism, but it can be more expensive, more difficult to handle. It might be more difficult to establish. What rootstock do you want? Bare root trees are quite cheap. They're easy to transport and move around, but there's quite a limited species selection, and there's a much narrower planting season you can plant them in. The big one, species selection, really. What do you want? What characteristics do you want? How much space have you got to plant it in? There's so many different options to think of. There's I've got manuals here behind me of nursery catalogues that you can go and look at. There's hundreds and hundreds of different options for species, size, and rootstock. If you're just guessing, you're probably going to get it wrong. So really take time to think about it, do some research, and again, speak to the arboriculturalist if you can. And you too may have a beautiful street tree like this, horse chestnut, also in Stonehouse. Lots of my pictures are from Stonehouse. I do get to see other places, but I do also end up taking lots of pictures of trees around my hometown. So there we go. How to plant a tree. We cover this in our document as well. A pit size. You don't need to dig down too deep. People often plant trees too deeply. That really doesn't do them much good. Plant them no deeper than you need to, but probably twice as wide as the root bore you've got. Before you put the tree in the ground, you might want to do a bit of formative pruning with nice, clean, sharp secateurs. Take out those co-dominant stems. It's much easier to prune a tree when it's lying on its side than it is when you put it in the ground and staked it and it's up there and you go, oh, I wish I'd taken that little broken branch off, because it will bug you forever when you're walking past it. You might as well deal with it before it goes in the ground at all. Stakes and ties. I've said it several times, but please, 2 stakes is ideal. Rubber ties works very, very well indeed. Mulch. I say it again, mulch is magical. Mulch, mulch, mulch. There's nothing you can't cover up with a bit of mulch. Highly recommended. And when are you planting it? I've worked on many projects. I was at Transport for London for 10 years and worked on lots of projects down there. And unfortunately, when a project finishes and they're ready to plant the trees, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be in the planting season. Plant your trees between October and March, ideally. You try and avoid planting trees when they're in leaf. Deciduous trees, essentially. You don't want to have that planting shock. So think carefully about when you're planting them. Plant a tree in full leaf in the middle of summer, you're going to have to give it a hell of a lot of water if you're going to keep that thing alive. So try and think of the seasons. Plant in the appropriate planting season. I could talk about this site all day long. I won't. It's like a how not to plant trees. But we've got the single stake that's rubbing up against the tree on the day it was planted, too tightly bound with a rubber tie. There's already some damage to the tree on the left-hand side because it was just smashed as it was coming off the truck. The tree on the right-hand side has been planted beneath the canopy of an existing tree. They must have actually had to have weaved it into the canopy to get it in there. And I can tell you right now what's happened. Someone's done a design. They've drawn out nice space green blobs on a map, and they've not taken into account the trees that are already there. Too often we see designers designing to what they wish was there rather than what's actually there. And with trees, you really want to take into account the existing trees as well, because they're already established, they're already delivering all of those benefits we talked about. Young tree aftercare is incredibly important. Watering I'll mention again in just a minute. Regular monitoring. Don't plant your tree and walk away from it forever. Go back and look at it every year. Check up on it. If it's not your tree, if it's on a project, encourage your client to go back and think about it a lot. Weed around the tree pit. Weed and grass growing around the trees. That's competition for the trees. They don't really need any competition. And you can fix that, of course, with mulch, because mulch is brilliant. Check your stakes and ties, move them around if you need to. Make sure that they're never going to get to the point where your tree is damaging itself on the thing that you were hoping would protect it. Formative pruning to remove any damaged, broken, crossing branches that aren't going to help the tree now or in the future. And just one more time for good measure, mulch. Yes, mulch, mulch, mulch. Otherwise, you're going to end up with trees like this. I think watering, a lack of watering, is probably the main reason that trees die. In my experience, the second main reason that young trees die is because of people strimming too close to the base. The enthusiastic grass cutter will go close with the strimmer and they'll end up ringbarking the tree like this, which will, of course, kill it. Trees are pretty impressive, magical things, but if you remove all the bark from all the way around them, they're not going to survive. How do you stop the strimmers from going too close to the base? Yes, of course, it's mulch. A nice mat of mulch around the tree, because then the grass doesn't grow and then the strimmers have got no need to go anywhere near the tree. So if you're planting in soft landscapes particularly, do whatever you can to keep those strimmers back, because the work of years can be undone through just a bit of clumsy or lazy grass cutting. Tree watering is just so important. I really can't overstate how important it is. I haven't got any statistics to back this up, but I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that the majority of young trees that die have died because of a lack of water. We saw many trees last year in the heat wave really suffering and dying because they weren't getting enough water. How much is enough? It's difficult to say. There's lots of variables going on, but we tend to recommend that you should be putting about 50 litres a week on a newly planted tree. If you've got a watering pipe, then you could put half of that down the watering pipe and half of it on the surface of the tree. It varies, but as a rule of thumb, about 50 litres per week. We recommend that during the summer months for the first 3 years after planting. It may well be that after you monitored your trees every year, you decide that it needs a little bit more help. That's fine. But as a general rule, for the first 3 years after planting. Then use sustainable sources wherever you can. Most trees are currently watered using drinking water, potable water. I think that in a few years' time, and in decades to come, it will be seen as just an unbelievable scandal that our generations use drinking water to water our trees and flush our toilets and wash our cars. This is drinking water. It's an incredibly important commodity, and we are literally pouring it down the drain. So if you can use harvested rainwater, that's even better. If you've got a tree outside you want to water, you can use the water from your washing up bowl. You can use your bath water. You can recycle water, use the grey water to water the trees. They'll be absolutely fine with that, particularly in times of drought. And engage the community. This might not be quite so appropriate to people who are working with sort of private clients, but to local authorities, we always encourage them, use the community. If you've planted 1,000 trees and you've got to give each of those 1,000 trees 50 litres of water every week for about 16 weeks, that's an awful lot of people power. That's an awful lot of investment and money and time and an awful lot of water. So engage the community, get people to take a bit of responsibility, a bit of interest, a bit of ownership over the trees outside their house. The Arb Association has produced these watering tags. You can get these off the internet as well. You can print them off, laminate them, and stick them to the tree stake. And it just says, please water me. It's a little reminder to the community that tree is there. And it says, please water. Your bath, washing up, or rainwater is ideal. And try and water in the early morning or evening. And we've had quite a few local authorities now have been asking if they can put their logo on this so they can use it. And we've been more than happy to let them do that. And also, I'm very pleased to say that it's got a bit of international interest, this campaign as well. And these have now been translated into several different languages. I think about 8 or 9 different languages of different countries are now using these watering tags as well, which is really positive. The whole document actually has just been released in Swedish. So if you're a Swedish speaker and you're thinking you don't want to tackle the English version, fear not. We've preempted your problem and it is available on the Arb Association website in Swedish, should that be your language of choice. So a few conclusions, which will pretty much bring us in bang on 30 minutes, if I say this bit slightly more slowly than is natural. Conclusions. Think about establishment, not just planting. It's not enough to chuck them in the ground. You've got to look after them. You've got to think about how they're going to become mature trees, delivering all of these wonderful benefits that mature trees deliver to us. Planting is very, very, very easy to do. Anyone can chuck a tree in the ground, but it's very, very easy to get wrong. Don't waste time, money, effort, community well-being, client well-being by getting it wrong, because trees are an investment. They're one of the only assets that we use in the public realm that appreciates in value. From the day you plant it, it appreciates in value. It delivers more benefits cumulatively for decades and centuries to come. And all it takes is a little bit of effort, a little bit of investment, and a little bit of thought in those early days when you get it in the ground, and in those years afterwards as well. And the really important thing, expert help is available. We know landscapers, horticulturalists, garden designers, the horticulture sector plants probably as many trees as the arboricultural sector and has loads and loads of knowledge and experience in planting trees. But let's work together. Let's work together and share our knowledge, share our information. Collaboration is key. We need all of our different professional disciplines to work together to share this information if we're going to see these trees we're planting make it through to the ancient trees of the future. So that is me done 1 minute and 20 seconds earlier than I said. So now I feel like I've missed the deadline, but thank you very much. My email address is there. Please feel free to get in touch if you like. Lots of information on our website, trees.org.uk. And I believe there's some time for questions in a bit as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. That was fabulous. That was amazing. So thank you so much. We've had quite a few questions come in. So I will just read them out and see if you can answer them. So the first one is, should tree ties be removed after 1 year?
It all depends is the answer. I think what we often recommend is that sort of young tree maintenance period is maybe about 3 years. Again, it's a bit of a rule of thumb. Some trees will kick off and be really, really happy, and you might want to take your stake and ties off earlier than that. Some trees, after 3 years, they're still not exactly where you want them to be, so you might leave them on a bit longer. But we say about 3 years. I haven't seen many trees that are that much better condition after 1 year than on the day they were planted. So I say 1 year would be a bit premature, probably.
Brilliant, thank you. How much should you water new trees out of the summer season?
Out of the summer season, interesting one. There's some very interesting research being done about this in the Czech Republic about watering not just in summer and watering mature trees. And there will be a webinar about that at some point as well. But I don't have any particular knowledge or information about that. But what I would say is we normally just stick to summer. I mean, you probably start climatically, it can vary. So when it starts getting hot and dry, that's a good time to water. Just because you've had a couple of days of rain doesn't necessarily mean you should stop watering. We often get little showers in the summer. That doesn't mean that the ground is going to be saturated to the point that it needs, particularly if that ground was really hard. There'll be a lot of runoff, so it won't necessarily really penetrate into the ground like you need it to. So really, I don't know, May time through possibly even to September, depending on your local weather conditions. That's when it's really important to water the trees. All you're trying to do, yeah, think of the tree as a straw with leaves at the top and water at the bottom. When it comes into leaf, it's dragging water out of the soil and sending it up through the leaves. When it hasn't got enough water in the bottom to keep those leaves turgid at the top, the leaves wilt and then they die. So you got to keep chucking water in at the bottom. That's what we're trying to do. So when it's in leaf is the main thing, because we've got to try and keep that tree hydrated.
Great. So sort of in, like current conditions, when it's quite cold and frosty, would you be saying, don't put any water on at all?
I wouldn't necessarily recommend watering in the winter. I think it's probably unnecessary. I don't think, particularly broadleaf trees aren't really losing that much water in the winter because they haven't got any leaves on. Deciduous trees haven't got any leaves on, therefore they're not losing the water through evapotranspiration. Therefore, there's not that much need to top it up at the bottom. It's during the summer you want to really focus on it, particularly when water is such a valuable resource.
Okay, brilliant. This is a bit of a longer one. Do you advise putting a pipe to take water and air into the tree planting pit? If so, is it best for it to be vertical into the bottom of the pit or circling round the root ball as it goes down?
So the best way if you're going to use a watering pipe is probably to have it circling around the root ball, but you need to make sure it's perforated. Because otherwise what happens, and I've seen this many times before, I'm trying to think if I've got stuff I can use to show you, I haven't really. You have your watering pipe, you pour the water down. If it goes straight past the root ball, then all it's going to do is take all the water straight past the root ball and then go into the soil underneath it and then sort of disappear. You want to be making sure that the water is coming out around the root ball as it goes down. So watering pipes are great if they're installed properly. If they've not been installed properly, if anything, they could do more harm than good, because they're actually, you're just bypassing the bit of the tree that needs the water and sending it off somewhere else. So watering pipes are fine. If you're watering a tree with a watering pipe, like I said, about half of it down the pipe and about half of it on the surface is good practice. And the other thing you might have seen is watering bags as well. So you can have various ones available. Gator bags is one of the brand names that's often used. It's a sort of zip tie plastic bag type thing, hard wearing bag. You zip around the tree, you fill it with water, and then it slowly leaches out the bottom. So it's kind of over a period of time, it releases that water, and then you can actually take them off and use them on another tree as well. So quite a few local authorities use those now. And if you go to sort of Scandinavia in particular, you'll find often they use them on big trees too, 3, 4, 5 watering bags tied around the same tree. They're very popular out there.
Wow, I've not heard of that. That sounds good. Can I, when you said about the pipe, because I'm about to plant some trees next week, with the irrigation pipe going down the root ball, what kind of height should it be? Sort of halfway down, or?
Well, you want to make sure that the water is getting to the roots, essentially. Yeah. That's what you want to do. So if you put a watering pipe down that is much deeper than the root ball, then as you pour the water down there, if there's no perforation in it, you're just diverting the water past the roots down to the bottom. Some of it may well go there, but depending on what soil you've got and what sort of condition it is, it could well just be leaching straight out the bottom. So you just want to, if you're putting it in, you just need to make sure that it's actually taking the water where you want it to go, not bypassing where you want it to go.
Okay, great. Okay, moving on. What do you recommend as the best mulch material?
Normally we would recommend some organic mulch, really, so bark mulch or chipped. If you get a tree that's been removed or a tree surgeon's been working on removing some branches and they chip it, nice wood chip pile, well decomposed is quite nice. Anything will work really, but if you get organic bark mulch, that's really good, organic wood chippings, because then they not only keep the moisture in, they suppress weed growth, and then in time they keep the strimmers away, and then it also breaks down in time into the soil and it helps ameliorate the soil as well.
Fab. Nice. We've got more questions coming in. Okay, what is the correct way to stake a tree? Should the stake be inserted at a 45-degree angle towards the prevailing wind?
Well, we see lots of different ways of staking trees, and I think there's pros and cons to a lot of them. The main thing, and why I'm not a huge fan of the 45-degree angle, really, is because if you're going at 45-degree angle, then normally you'll be attaching the stake right up against the tree. And like we said, what happens then is, the way that a tree grows, the way it puts on secondary growth, thickening around the stem, and it gets bigger and bigger, is it reacts to the wind. It's the tree moving in the wind. So if you have rubber ties, then the tree can move around from the base and it'll start putting on even growth. As soon as you stop that tree from moving, the point, if you've got a stake right up against it, then everything below that can't move. So it is going to put on growth, but everything above the stake can move. So you're probably going to get a disparity in the growth rates. It's not that good for the tree. You kind of want to let them go a bit. The other thing as well is if you've got rubber ties, the tree is or should never get to the point where it's making contact with the stake, because it's miles away from the stake, it's that far away. If the stake is right up, pushed close against the tree, that's when you'll see it's causing bark damage. The tree will start growing over the stake. It will start kind of propping itself up on it. None of that is good for the tree at all.
Yeah, okay, that's really good to know. Biodiversity, do you have a magic combination of tree communities?
I'm not sure exactly what that means. Is this about sort of species diversity, perhaps?
I think they want to know is what the combination, like the percentage combination of native to non-native trees.
Okay, so I mean, again, it's all depends on the circumstances, and it's all kind of a matter of opinion in a way, really. There's no particular ratio for native or non-native, certainly. The point is, in the UK, we've got about 30 species of tree that we would sort of say are native, there or thereabouts. It's more complicated than that. We've got 100 odd white beams, but let's say about 30 species of tree. And of those 30, only about half a dozen ever grow to a substantial canopy. And with many of the benefits that trees bring us in urban areas, you want a big canopy. The bigger the canopy, the greater the benefit. So if we relied entirely on our native trees for amenity tree planting and urban tree planting, we would really not have very healthy urban forests at all, because there'd be very, very limited species. You'd have half a dozen big trees, and most of those have got health, pest and disease problems associated with them. So we need to diversify our tree species selection. We need to plant more diverse range of trees from a more diverse range of places. We need to protect ourselves for the future climate. We need to ensure biodiversity. That's not to say there's not a place for native trees. Native trees are very, very important. If I was planting woodland, I'd go for native trees probably more than anything else. But in urban environments, excuse me, street trees and the like, you just need to really disregard whether it's native or non-native. You just need to think about what's right for that place. But if you are getting non-native trees, or even native trees, any trees you're getting, if you're importing them into the country, you've just got to think about where they're coming from and the biosecurity controls around them.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, 2 more questions, then we probably better move on, just for time. Actually, yeah. Okay, should you give trees a gravel layer when preparing the tree pit?
Again, I think it varies. Some people like to and some people don't. It can be good on for clay soils, for example. If you're in really heavy clay soils where you've dug out the pit and you know that as soon as it rains, that pit's essentially going to fill with water, you may want to take out a bit deeper and then put down a decent gravel layer, which will allow better drainage. That's probably the only reason I think I'd really do that if I was planting into a garden or a park. But yeah, it very much depends on your soil conditions, really.
Yeah, good to know. Any recommended trees to sustain future droughts?
Well, I probably wouldn't go into a massive list of recommending individual tree species, but there is a very, very good resource online called, it's by TDAG, and it's, let me see if I can find it. Basically, it's a really, really good resource. Tree selection, something like that, and it tells you lots and lots of different trees. Tree species selection for green infrastructure. It gives you loads of different species of trees, lots of information about them. It tells you things like what does well in drought, what does well in flooded areas, and it's a really good sort of, again, not a replacement for specialist advice, but a really good place to get some of this information from. But we're finding quite a lot of success with things like what used to be Sephora japonica. They've changed the name now, and I've completely forgotten what it is. But pagoda trees, you know, they're doing quite well. There's loads and loads of stuff you can get out there.
Would you mind popping that URL onto the chat when?
I've just put it in.
Oh, well done, thank you. Okay, let's try and get through these last 2 questions. Are there some natives that may lend themselves to adaptation to our warmer climates? I guess that's kind of what we've just covered, actually.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's also the provenance of where those natives are coming from. You know, whether they're, so you can bring in native seed stock from other countries if the species is native to the UK. So it may be that you want to plant oaks, but you want to get your acorns from Spain, for example. It's you can have native trees that aren't from the UK, if you know what I mean. It's the same species, it's the provenance of where you're getting them from. But yeah, you know, they're moving around. The beech, so I'm in Gloucestershire, and we've got lots and lots of beech woodland around here. The beech are migrating northwards, essentially. In 100 years' time, you probably won't really have those beech woodlands around here because the climate's changing too much, but they're now finding a higher northern range. You know, native's a bit of a funny term anyway. Strawberry tree is native to the British Isles. It's just only native to Southern Ireland. Scots pine is native up to Scotland, but it's not really native down here. Native beech you don't find too far. It's kind of, you know, it's a rubbish term.
Okay, final question, and this is quite a long one. Are there any biodegradable rabbit-proof tree protection wraps that you can recommend? How long should these be kept for? And I've seen whips with plastic tree guards, but the whips are shorter than the guards. Is this the correct way of doing it? Sorry, so there's 2 questions in one.
No, it's fine. So I should say this isn't really my area of expertise. This is more sort of woodland creation or perhaps even forestry. But I would say, first of all, that, yeah, I can understand why people would plant the whips shorter than the guards, because you're trying to give them a little chance to get down some growth before they pop above the level of the guard, which is when they start getting browsed off by the animals. there's an old French saying that the bramble is the midwife of the oak. The trees that survive well as open grown trees are normally the ones that happen to have been planted by jays or something like that in an area of bramble. So that by the time they peak their heads up above the bramble, they're thick enough and strong enough to be able to protect themselves against the large ungulates, or whether it's cows or aurochs or whatever it is, and killing them there. So that kind of protection is very, very effective. Biodegradable rabbit-proof tree protection. We often see things that are promised to be biodegradable. A lot of the plastic guards we promise to be biodegradable. Sometimes I think they're sold on the basis of the fact that by the time you realize they're not biodegradable, everyone else has moved on and you can't get your money back from the supplier. I've seen ones made of sheep's wool and various other things, and there's a lot of research being done into this. But I have also heard lots of people saying, people who know more about this than I do, if you want to grow a bit of an area of woodland, for example, it can be more cost effective to put up rabbit fencing around it and leave it than it is to plant lots of individual trees and protect them all individually. Nature has been growing trees quite happily for quite a long time, and we can give it that helping hand by actually protecting a whole area rather than looking to protect individual trees.
Fabulous. That has been amazing. So informative. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I'm not going to, we've got through the questions. I'm not going to ask, was any hand ups? No. Okay, fabulous. Thank you so much, John. I know you've been on webinars all day, so fair enough if you want to jump off, but we're now going to move over to Richard to talk about his section. So I will let you, Richard, take over. That's okay.
So I'll mute myself.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you, John. That was really fascinating. I learned loads of stuff from that and was reminded of lots of stuff that I shouldn't have forgotten, but have. So yeah, very interesting. Well, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Richard Arnold. I run a tree surgery company mainly, and a consultancy as well. We're based in Sevenoaks, and I've been at this for 25 years or so now. So I've had quite a lot of experience with various aspects of tree surgery, starting in domestic side, dealing with everything from shrub pruning up to large tree removal. Lots of tree planting as well. Some of it may have been good. Some of it may originally, at the start, not have been that good. You always feel the pressure when you're planting trees. So that was drummed home by John's talk there. We've moved into a lot more sort of commercial work over the years. We've got 20 odd of us working at Treecraft at the moment. So we take on work all through the southeast, and we have mostly tree surgery and one chap who does consultancy for us, and I get sort of involved in all of it. So I get to have a good overview, which is good. Although I spent, a lot of time learning to climb trees and perfecting my skills climbing around trees. And then gradually I spent less and less time up trees and more time here, sitting in front of a computer or behind the wheel of a car. So anyway, it's always good to talk about trees, and hopefully I will have something of interest for you. It seems like a bit of a dry subject on the face of it, but there's lots to talk about, and there's lots of that will cross over with your work, I think. So basically, talk a little bit about what a tree surgeon is, what an arboriculturist is, what an arborist is, an arb consultant. There's all these terms used for tree people as well as foresters and so on. But on the amenity side, it's arboriculture really. And it can be a bit confusing because you've got different people giving you advice. Some of them may know what they're talking about through either studying or long experience, and others may not. There's a lot of talking off the top of people's heads and things like that. So it's really just to give you some pointers to, things to consider when you're engaging arboricultural professionals.
Richard, I just wanted to say you haven't shared your slides. If you
No. Oh yeah. Okay. I was just doing a bit of preamble.
No worries.
Thank you. I'll stop rambling in a minute. And then I was going to go on and just sort of talk a little about the differences between TPOs and con areas, and then onto a little bit of other stuff. I will share my thing now because I better start getting through this. Otherwise, we'll be here at midnight, aren't we? So share screen. So I must apologise for my PowerPoint not being quite as polished as John's, but anyway, hopefully you'll get the idea. It's a bit more cluttered looking, perhaps. Let me just find my other screen so I can scroll through it. So I've got a start slideshow somewhere. Very professional and slick from beginning. There we go. We're on. So yeah, tree preservation orders and trees in conservation areas, and when you might need an arboriculturist or whatever one of those is. So some definitions. So a tree surgeon or contracting arborist, maybe, these are people that carry out generally the practical tree work. So they'll be the guys swinging around from a rope, throwing stuff through chippers, making lots of noise generally, stump grinding, planting, that kind of things. I'll come on to it a little bit more later. These guys should have a minimum of an NPTC qualification, which is a competency qualification suite that most people use as LANTRA as well. But they should have be able to evidence that they've got some professional training and level of competency. They should also be experienced in what they're doing. So probing, that's a good thing to do. An arboriculturist or arboricultural consultant, people will argue with me about this probably. But, you know, generally I think of these as people who probably a bit more experience, perhaps, often with a formal qualification, maybe a degree, sort of level 4 and upwards tends to be a benchmark, but, you know, it's not hard and fast, I don't think. In-depth knowledge, they should have an in-depth knowledge of working with trees and a wealth of experience to draw upon. And they can do tree inspections, surveys, and give you professional advice and so on. So that's the difference there. They're going to be less, you know, hands-on, but some crossover. I mean, I do both things. So there you go. There's no hard and fast. When we come on to conservation areas and TPOs, I mean, likely as garden designers for your clients, you will, on occasion, have to deal with protected trees, and trees are protected in one way or another. And often in urban areas, it will be either because they're in a conservation area or they've got a tree preservation order, TPO. There are other types of protection I'll just cover briefly later, but conservation area is really buildings it was designed to protect buildings of particular character, you know. So the areas that are designated conservation area isn't about nature conservation particularly, it's about architectural conservation, but trees get drawn into that because they enhance the area, you know, visual amenity, they enhance the area, so they bring out the best of this sort of architectural these architectural features. So they're protected, and all trees above, you know, above that sort of 7.5 centimeters trunk diameter are protected in conservation areas by dint of the fact that you have to notify the council before you want to carry out any work to them. When you do notify them, they've got 6 weeks notice, 6 weeks in which to consider your notice. They can either decide they've got no objection and they'll issue a no objection letter to you, or they can, if they want to stop you doing what you're planning to do, they can make a tree preservation order on the tree if they think the tree's worthy of that. If there's no response within 6 weeks, then you can technically get on with the work, although I would advise caution on that, because it might be you've missed a letter or something like that that's turned up, or an email where they've said, you know, we're not happy with this. I mean, usually there's no doubt because they have to serve their client with a TPO, which is a whole lot of paperwork, but, you know, worth checking on the website or giving them a quick call just to double check before you press on, especially if you're removing a significant tree. There is also another caution here where you can, and it can be a bit embarrassing, if you apply for work in a conservation area to a tree that you say want to remove or want to reduce the crown on quite hard or something like that, if a local authority disagrees, remember their only course of action is to put a tree preservation order on that tree. So it's worth being sure that what you're asking for is likely to get through okay, and worth forewarning your client that, you know, if we're notifying the council about this, there is a risk that you may end up with a tree preservation order there, in which case you're going to have to go back through the application process, and probably what you wanted to do with that tree, you're not going to be able to do. So it's just worth considering. It can be a little bit embarrassing. Tree preservation orders are actual statutory protection on either an individual tree, groups of trees, or woodlands. Any tree work basically must be applied for, including severance of any roots or anything that might disturb the roots. But there are a couple of exemptions which I'll cover, which you can do under a 5-day notice. This is an 8-week application period, and the local planning authority, LPA, I've shortened it to because it's too long to say, can take longer on occasion to issue a decision, which is very frustrating. But the only thing you can do about that is appeal to the planning inspectorate, and they take ages to do anything about it. So you're better off waiting for the LPA to make a decision on it. Yeah, it can be annoying, but you've got no option but to wait on those, because if you go ahead and do anything, then you'll be in breach of the law, and there's fines and so on for that, quite big fines if they decide to push it. And so they can refuse or consent with conditions or modifications. Sometimes we get them through where they say, well, you know, we'd rather you didn't do this, but you can, you know, we'd rather you didn't reduce the crown by 4 meters, but we'd be happy with a 2 meter reduction or something like that. They're the more helpful local authorities. Some are less helpful, but then they're all pressed for time, I suppose. So that's tree preservation orders in a nutshell. As for what can be protected by a TPO, well, you need to be careful, because, you know, pretty much any tree that's, again, above that sort of size, so quite small trees above the 7.5 centimetre size could be protected, any species. And you come down to the definition of a tree. I mean, I would typically not consider cherry laurel to be a tree, although it does grow to reach tree-like proportions. But we have worked on a site that had a TPO cherry laurel. So never assume, I guess, is the take home from that. The trees can be on private or public land. Local authorities can TPO their own trees if they feel that they're at risk for one reason or another. The trees must have amenity value, so they're enhancing the visual look of an area, which means they have to be quite visible. Often they're bigger trees, but they can be smaller trees where they're clearly visible. Yeah, must be visible from public vantage points usually. There are other types of protection as well, which is, so it's not just TPOs and conservation areas. And you should be aware of things like felling licenses, and it's quite easy to fall foul of not getting a felling license when you should. And if you're removing a large number of trees and it's not from a domestic back garden, if it's from, say, you know, a public place or something like that, then you may be required to get a felling license, any more than 5 cubic meters of timber, which isn't very much. So it's worth being aware of and looking into if you're not sure. Planning conditions, sometimes planning conditions protect trees, and your local authority should be able to let you know about that. There's not too much of that, but it's a sort of a bit of a lazy thing where they should have been superseded by actually making a TPO, but yeah, the council hasn't got around to it. I haven't come across that much, actually. Then you've got things like sites of special scientific interest, SSSIs, and other sort of nature conservation areas and so on, where bodies like Natural England will have a say in what you can do, and you must apply to them. So again, you will probably know this about the site you're working on, but it's just worth bearing in mind that you can't just carry out tree work even if there's not a TPO at all. Yeah. And then there's various wildlife legislation which you can fall foul of. Mostly the things what we worry about with trees are bats. Bats roost in trees quite regularly, rest in trees. There's very large fines for disturbing even bats, not killing. So, and it's per bat as well. So if you manage to fell a tree with a roost in it, you're going to be sweating a bit. Nesting birds as well is the obvious one. So, you know, timing of work and so on for nesting birds is quite easy. Bats can sort of be in trees any time of year just to make life difficult for you. So you might need an ecologist to confirm whether or not there are bats on particular sites. How to find out if a tree is protected? Well, the more helpful local authorities have online portals where you can, you know, zoom in and select TPOs and con areas. That's really useful. I would say whether they're 100% accurate all the time, I don't know, but it's quite a good defense. If you've checked it, found the property, get a screenshot of it and save that, so you've got evidence that you know you've looked and there was nothing there at the time you looked. That's probably, even if there was something you're not aware of, it's going to be quite a good defense. Other than that, really, it's ringing local authorities. Some are very slow to respond, or emailing. Email's good because you got it in writing then as well. They're getting better, I would say, at doing that. More and more are going online, which is great because you can look at any time of day. It's very handy. This, I just thought I put this in. I'm not going to go over it too much, but this is a sort of example of an evaluation form that like a local authority might use when deciding whether or not a tree merits a TPO. So these trees in conservation areas, for example, that you're putting a notice in to work on, if they're thinking, oh, you know, I might make a TPO on that, they have to go through this process to justify it. And so this form, you'll be able, I'll share this as a PDF, and it's quite useful if you're looking at a tree thinking, you know, assessing the risk of there ending up a TPO on it. You can probably go through this process yourself, and, you know, work it out from there. Unfortunately, tree officers seem to be so busy at the moment that they won't come to site for an informal discussion, which would be really useful because you could sort of show them what you're thinking and they go, no, I wouldn't do that, or yeah, I'm fine with that, or whatever. Very few will do that anymore, which is a shame. But yeah, they have to be able to justify their decision, basically, if they're going to make a TPO. So that was in there just to look at. Exemptions I mentioned. So basically the main exemption, it sort of changed a bit a few years ago. I won't go into that, but basically deadwood removal from trees, fine, and removal of dead trees, fine. You have to still submit a 5-day notice, email or something to the local authority, just so they know what you're doing. Take lots of photos as well, so you've got evidence if someone questions your judgment. There's something else I was going to say on that. I can't remember what it was. In any case, things like dangerous trees and dying trees, which sort of used to be exemptions, you will need to, unless it's a sort of imminent risk of it coming down. Obviously, if it's a tree overhanging a road that's creaking and then, you know, there's splits opening in it or something, then you can just do that, take a bunch of photos and get it sorted. But if it's sort of, you know, less imminently dangerous, you can still take it down, but you probably will need to apply, and you may need an arboriculture report to accompany it. The planning portal where you apply for all this stuff does have a requirement that you submit a report of some sort with it from an arboriculturist or someone qualified to do so. You can also, there's some acts of parliament, highways legislation, actionable nuisance, felon licenses, full planning permission and things like that. But I would again say just make sure that you are sure of your ground and that that exemption applies, because even the highway stuff, if it's not desperately urgent, most local authorities still say fine, but you need to apply for it. Yeah, lots of photos. Submitting applications. Anybody can submit an application for working on any tree. You could apply for one for your neighbour or someone 10 doors down or at the other end of the country. doesn't mean that you can carry out the work once you've got the consent, because you need the landowners, the tree owners' consent to do it. You do that through the planning portal, which some of you may be using regularly, others may not have used. It's very user-friendly, quite easy to do. So for the majority of tree work applications, you can probably do these things yourself for your client. There might just be the odd occasion where you need to get an arboriculturist involved, tree surgeon or arboriculturist. Usually if a tree surgeon's quoting for doing work for you, they will, as part of the service, just do the TPO application. We find on, with more contentious trees, often it helps if you submit a short report with it to sort of justify why you're doing it. It sort of adds a bit of weight to it and often increases the success rate. Not always, no guarantee. There's a bit about the information required there. The planning portal requires, a fair bit of information from you. Some councils, it's a little bit inconsistent. Some councils ask for more information than others, which I find a bit frustrating, really. I think they should all operate in the same way when it comes to that, but they don't. So it's worth learning the areas you work in, what the councils are going to want, because some want kind of lots of photos and extra bits and bobs, and others aren't bothered and sort of wade through most stuff. So you'll get to learn the way they operate. These are just a couple of things. It's just the process for doing a tree preservation order or application or a con area application. I'm not going to go through that, but I just put that in there for your information. It's just the government website. So the professionals. So as I mentioned earlier, you're contracting arborists are going to be the people you're most likely to see, because usually with garden design work, I guess if you're having a proper revamp, there's going to be some trees that at very least need a bit of pruning to make space or lighter areas or whatever, and there might be some trees that are going to need to be removed in order to replace with more desirable trees for your scheme or what have you. And so these will be the guys you contact, and they'll be able to help you out with TPOs and things like that. As I've said, it's worth being a bit cautious, because pretty much anybody with a chainsaw could call themselves a tree surgeon. And you've probably seen driving around, there's a huge number of guys driving around with chippers and trucks now, and some of them will be very good and do great work, and others perhaps less so. So it's worth having a few checks. You can get some references from previous clients. Perhaps they should all know about British Standard 3998, which is recommendations for tree work. If they don't know about that, I would question whether they know what they're doing. They should all adhere to health and safety legislation. They should all have insurance. They should all have their NPTC qualifications at least, and have some sort of, I would say have some sort of complaints process or accountability if things either go wrong or are not done to the client's satisfaction, that kind of thing. It can be difficult because, a two-man tree surgery band isn't going to have like a complaints department or something like that, but you should be sure that if there's a problem, you're going to be able to find them again at the very least. So as John mentioned, the ARB approved contractor scheme is very good. We're approved contractors. It's a rigorous scheme that sort of vets the whole of your business through health and safety, environmental care, your tree work, tree knowledge, compliance on all that front, and your customer care procedures are thoroughly vetted as well. So it's a good place to start at least, and you can find information on your local ARB-approved contractors online, as mentioned earlier. How am I going for time, by the way, Julia? We've got.
You have about 15 minutes left, including questions. So far, I've got 2 questions.
Cool. All right. I'll speed up a bit. Sorry. So your arboricultural consultant, then they're there for professional advice and sort of solutions to problems, I suppose. more detailed tree work applications, tree safety surveys, detailed inspections of trees, development site surveys, tree management plans. Cautions there, they should have a recognised qualification usually, although experience counts for a lot as well. Should be carrying professional indemnity insurance of at least £1 million, and have some background that you can check on. So this is British Standard 3998. As with all British standards, it's expensive, but it is good, and it's worth being aware of what's in it. So, I mean, I kind of recommend buying it if you feel like spending a few quid. There's often copies floating around. I mean, basically the crux is that, you know, tree work that's poorly carried out is going to end up damaging the health of trees. And, you know, from your point of view as garden designers, you know, your clients are relying on you to employ people who are going to work appropriately on trees. So this is a great guide that your contractors should know about, and so if you know about it, so much the better. British Standard 5837 covers trees in relation to design, demolition, construction. I mean, you may or may not be involved in sort of large-scale construction, but there's a lot of crossover here into what you're doing, you know, sort of on the landscaping side where you're working around trees, and it's mainly to do with tree roots and tree root protection. So it might be appropriate if you've got a big scheme going on in a garden with lots of existing trees, which you're planning on retaining perhaps, it might be worth having an arboricultural survey to show you where the root protection areas will be so that you can lay your scheme out appropriately and perhaps, I don't know, avoid too much hard standing where there's tree roots. Obviously, if the trees are TPO'd, you would have to apply for particular work anyway. This is an example of the sort of plan you get, and these circles around each of the trees here are their root protection area, which is equivalent to 12 times the trunk diameter at 1.5 meters from ground level. So it can be quite a big area and could be quite restrictive. So it's a good thing to know, as John was saying, at the start, at the planning stage, what you're working with in terms of constraints from trees, because there's nothing worse than putting in a beautiful scheme and then trees start sort of dying off one by one over a period of years. So I would recommend, and yeah, as per, I just added a note there, as per John's talk, take care of the trees that are there because they're already delivering for you. So if there's good trees there, look after them, look after the ground. So tree roots, I mean, this is the sort of common misconception with tree roots, is that they're very deep and perhaps don't spread very far, but this is actually the more correct model, where they're very shallow. Most roots are in the top metre of soil and they spread a long way, you know, a long way outside the crown drip line. And so it's very easy when carrying out works to, you know, to damage all these. Where's my laser pointer? Yeah, so damage all these sort of roots out here. You know, you're well outside the drip line, but you could isolate the tree from a huge amount of its root system, which is not going to help the tree. So it's not just the tree roots, it's all this stuff as well, which is the fungal association, mycorrhizal fungi, which spreads again even further than the roots. So there's a lot to think about with the soil and, you know, other organisms in the soil. So you really need to look after that soil because it's alive, it's not just dirt, and it will help not only the trees that are there, but the trees that you're going to plant survive as well. You know, you want your trees to thrive, and so they need good soil to go into. So if you've got good soil on site, then protect it through your project. This is an example of some stuff that can go awry. You know, a lot of that tree's root system's been taken away. You know, there's damage to the trunk here. Probably this tree's not going to survive too well. Maybe in a strong wind that is going to blow over as well. So you need to be very careful of what's under the ground. So think about the roots and soil, assess the likely impacts of your project, protect what is there soil wise and tree root wise, improve it if necessary, adding organic material. As John mentioned, organic material mulching is just invaluable. It's so cheap to do and it's just so effective. I just can't recommend it enough. And seek arboricultural advice if there are significant trees there that you think are going to be a problem. There are these, just very quickly, these no-dig sort of surfacing solutions. So it doesn't mean you can't hard surface where there are roots. There are solutions, you know, you can fill these cellular confinement systems with angular stone and then you top them off with, you know, whatever surface you want, ideally permeable, but you can tarmac on them, you can put block paving on them. They're load bearing, you know, they come in different grades. So anything from pedestrian grade to HGV grade, very good and cost effective. And the people that, well, I say cost effective, they're quite expensive, but worth it if the trees are worth saving. And the companies that produce them are very helpful. So there you go. This is a company called Rekin that produced this little image, and but there are several, and they're all very helpful in designing for you and working with you. So that's everything I've got to say. Thanks for listening. Sorry, it was a bit of a ramble. I wasn't sure how long it'd take, but
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard. Fabulous. Okie doke. So I've got some questions.
sure.
Okay. If work was done on a tree which needed permission but didn't have it, who is responsible for the fine? Is it the householder or the tree surgeon?
Well, I mean, the old saying is it's he who holds the chainsaw. I think the answer probably is really a bit of both. I think the courts would decide, really, but certainly the people wielding the chainsaw is not enough. From our point of view, it's not enough to say, well, you know, the client told us that there was no TPO on the tree, so we just, you know, went ahead and did it. It's their fault, because, you know, you've got to do your due diligence, and we check every site we're working on anyway. So we would expect if something went wrong, we'd be carrying the can mostly, I think is the answer there.
Okay, that's a bit scary.
But, you know, there are cases where the landowner has been fined, although I think in most cases where that happens, you know, it's a sort of fly-by-night tree surgeon they just got in, because most reputable tree surgeons won't do the work because they will check, or they've done the work themselves, you know, in the middle of the night or something. There was that classic one down in Sandbanks where a chap felled his neighbour's pine trees, which were TPO'd, so it would improve his view over the, you know, Brownsea Island, that Poole Harbour, isn't it? And he was fined quite a lot, which was gratifying.
Yeah, I guess the trees were dead.
Yeah.
I know, I have heard the fines are quite massive. Okay, we've got another question. If you're applying for permission to take down some trees and assuming you want to replace them, are some replacement trees more likely to help your application to get through than others? If so, do you have any general guidance?
Not really. I mean, you can, yes, I mean, the answer probably is yes, but if you're taking down an oak tree and you're proposing to replace it with a crabapple, probably not going to be looked upon too favourably. I mean, it does depend on what the situation, every situation is different, isn't it? And depends on the reason for the tree coming out in the first place, subsidence or something like that. It might be arguable to replace with a smaller tree that's not going to be a problem in the future. But usually what they like to see is a tree that's going to grow to a reasonable size, so a medium to large tree, if you're removing a medium to large tree, I suppose. Yeah. So I don't think there's any magic answer though. It's, and again, local planning authorities aren't particularly consistent.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's the message that, yeah, it's the inconsistency is annoying, isn't it? Okay, I've had a few more. Are we correct to assume that root protection zone will need to be considered even for a small garden studio, i.e. a 4x3 meter studio, which is very typical of what London designers are installing?
Well, I mean, depends what you mean by that. I mean, you should take it into account if there's a decent tree there. So, for example, you know, if you're constructing something very close to an existing mature tree, and you're planning on putting a concrete slab in or something like that, that you know is going to impact the roots, then you might want to think about tweaking your design so that you don't do that. You know, maybe sit it on piles, posts or something like that sunk into the ground, so you're minimizing the impact on the root system, and building some lintels round to sit the thing on. In terms of actual, you know, whether the council enforces you root protection areas and so on, again, depends on the local authority. I mean, a lot of these garden buildings are permitted development anyway, you know, exempt from planning permission, and so the local authority would never be involved anyway. So that's really down to, it's really down to your how you want to manage it and how the client wants to manage it. If the local authority is involved, some of them may ask for an ARB report, which will have root protection areas in, and some won't. Again, back to this sort of inconsistency. They should all ask for them, really, and they should all enforce them, but it's a kind of, again, a sort of time poor thing, I think, a lot of the time, where they just don't have the time to enforce all this stuff. But again, you know, if in doubt, get some arboricultural advice, I would say.
Okay, it's a good idea though to set them on, what do you call them, lintels and...
Yeah, sort of posting it. So in construction, it's a sort of pile and beam construction. So you sink piles into the ground at various intervals and have a spanning beam going around it, which you then build up on. I'm no great expert on it, but you know, there's ways of constructing things which aren't just poured concrete as a slab, or trench foundations, you know, poured concrete trenches. So there are more or less tree friendly versions of.
Okay.
So yeah, definitely worth considering though. If you've got good trees there and you're going to go trenching or putting a slab down, you're going to trash the roots and the tree's going to suffer basically at the end of the day. It's
Okay, we've got 1 minute. We've got one final question. Is it a good idea to aerate the soil under a struggling tree using a garden fork?
It depends on why the tree's struggling. If it's struggling from soil compaction, can't really hurt to do that yet. It's good low tech sort of thing. I would say you could do that and stick some mulch down, let the earthworms do the decompaction for you if they're there. Mulch is really good because it gets taken down into the soil, and then all the soil microorganisms and worms and so on do the job of sort of breaking the soil up. But it might be that it's such a hard pan that you need to break it up with something first. And a garden fork's not a bad thing to use. Go gently with, don't go turning the soil over, but put the fork in and give it a wiggle at various intervals, like if you were aerating your lawn, that kind of thing. Yeah, I don't think it can hurt anyway. But it does depend why the tree's struggling.
Yeah, good point. Fab. Okay, that is the end of the questions. Tris, you should be able to speak if you want to speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, great. Yes, sorry, hi. I just really wanted to say on behalf of us all a huge thank you to Richard and John. If John's still with us, he may have popped off. Really, really interesting and informative talks. Absolutely brilliant. I think it's so important for designers, for us all to get a great insight really into to what you do and the expertise you have and how you can work with us. So thank you so much for that. Also, we've got some fabulous links as well, and handouts and that we can, you know, in the posters that we can reach out and get hold of. And yeah, there's just lots of information that came from that, and as I say, further CPD for us all from all those links that you've both provided. So a huge thank you, and also a huge thank you to Julia. I run this group with her, and she has set all of this up for all our members tonight, and we're still administering it from over in Australia on a recent holiday. So I think, you know, many thanks to all three of you for putting this on for us this evening, and I'm sure we've all really enjoyed it, and I've certainly taken a lot from it.
Thank you, Tris. And thank you, Richard. I completely second everything she said. That was brilliant. And I think John has dropped off, but if John or Sarah, who's their administrator at the ARB Association, is still on, thank you so much. And I think because it's 9 o'clock at night, I'll probably end it and everyone can go and watch some telly.
Great.
All right. Thank you very
Thanks,
much,
everyone.
everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.